In the dead of night, beneath the unforgiving glare of a single spotlight, a storm of secrets is about to unravel. Behind the cold walls of an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Uptown, hidden truths are forced to surface, truths so dangerous they threaten to shatter everything built on power, wealth, and fragile loyalty. What began as a quiet betrayal has spiraled into a web of manipulation, fear, and desperation. In this place, trust no longer exists, only the sharp edge of survival remains. The night was suffocating. A narrow beam of headlights sliced through the wet darkness, illuminating the abandoned warehouse at the edge of Uptown. Once a place of industry, now it stood like a grave, rusted steel panels, broken windows, peeling paint, and silence so thick it felt alive. The rain was relentless, tapping against the corrugated walls like the ticking of a clock counting down towards something inevitable. The air was damp and cold, the kind that creeps beneath the skin and anchors itself deep in the bones. Everything about this night carried the weight of something final. Randy's boots sank slightly into the mud as he approached. Every step echoed, though the sound was swallowed almost immediately by the hollow cavern inside. He knew something waited beyond that heavy steel door. He could feel it. There was a certain stillness in the air, a kind of silence that doesn't belong to empty places but to traps. The door gave way with a low groan, and the light from the car behind him slashed into the room like a blade. At the center of the warehouse, Hayley sat tied to an old wooden chair. Her body was rigid, wrists bound tight enough to leave raw, angry marks around her skin. Her head tilted slightly upward, and beneath the wet strands of her hair, her eyes burned with terror. The tape across her mouth absorbed every desperate breath, muffling the sound into nothing but shallow gasps. But it wasn't her that made Randy's heart stop. It was the figure standing opposite her, bathed in the harsh white glow. Tomas. There was nothing familiar in his face now. It wasn't the ally who had stood by their side for years, nor the man who once carried their secrets as if they were his own. Under the harsh light, his features were carved into something cold and calculated. In his hand, the small screen of a phone glowed faintly. From it came the sound of a recording, grainy, distorted, but unmistakably real. Two voices. Hayley and Bill. Their words, once hidden behind closed doors, now filled the empty space with a brutal kind of truth. This wasn't just evidence. This was a detonator. The sound of that recording was like a knife turning inside Randy's chest. He had thought betrayal, if it ever came, would arrive from outside their fragile circle, not from its core. But here it was, raw and undeniable. Hayley. Bill. Their whispered secrets. And Tomas, who had unearthed it all like someone digging up a long-buried corpse. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than any threat could ever be. Randy saw it in his eyes. Tomas hadn't stumbled on this by chance. He had waited for this. Planned for it. This was not an act of impulse, it was the careful culmination of something that had been rotting beneath the surface for a very long time. Inside Randy, something shifted. A tide of fury rose like a storm, colliding with shock, confusion, and the unbearable sting of humiliation. He wasn't just angry at Hayley or Bill. He was angry at himself. For trusting too easily. For never noticing the cracks. For being nothing more than a pawn in a game someone else had been playing for months, maybe years. He saw it now, with painful clarity, Tomas's quiet patience, his withdrawn demeanor, his calm presence. It had never been loyalty. It had been calculation. The warehouse seemed to shrink around them. The damp air clung to his lungs. Every heartbeat felt louder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were pulsing in rhythm with his rage. He stared at Hayley. Her wide, desperate eyes pleaded for something, understanding, forgiveness, survival. But to him, they only reflected questions that had no answers. What had she done? Why had she done it? And worse, how long had she been lying? She wasn't just a victim tied to a chair. She was the axis around which everything had begun to spin out of control. Tomas moved slowly around her. Each step was deliberate, almost silent, like the pacing of a predator who already knew its prey had nowhere to run. He didn't need to lift a hand. The recording did everything for him. It carved open old wounds, dragged hidden things into the light, and left them bleeding in the air between the three of them. Randy realized with a sinking, sickening weight, Tomas wasn't after Hayley alone. This was bigger. This was a strike meant to shatter the Dupree family from its core. For years, Tomas had been standing on the periphery, a shadow within their polished world. They had never truly seen him, not the bitterness festering inside, not the humiliation disguised behind polite smiles. Every party, every deal, every moment he was dismissed or overlooked had become fuel. And tonight, he stood in the center of the storm he had built. The betrayal was not spontaneous. It was methodical, nurtured like a seed planted long ago, finally blooming into something poisonous. Randy's pulse hammered in his ears. He was caught in the unbearable pull of two forces, rage and reason. One part of him wanted to lunge forward, to rip Tomas apart for touching what was his. Another part, colder and sharper, knew that everything Tomas held in his hand could destroy them without him ever lifting a finger. The recording was only the beginning. There were more secrets, there had to be. Secrets hidden beneath polished facades, whispered behind closed doors, sealed in envelopes labeled never to be revealed. Rain beat against the metal roof. The sound merged with the low static of the recording, creating a rhythm that tightened the tension like a noose. Randy could almost hear the past collapsing under the weight of what Tomas had exposed. All the loyalty, all the alliances, it was all an illusion. And beneath the calculated control in Tomas's expression, something raw twisted. His fury was quiet, but not weak. It was the kind that festers in silence for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. For too long he had been the outsider, the loyal servant to a family that treated him as a convenient extension of their will. They had underestimated the one person who had been watching the longest. And now, he was standing at the center of their ruin, holding the match. Randy's hands curled into fists. The fury inside him coiled tighter, feeding on fear, on confusion, on betrayal. He wanted to act, but he couldn't. Because no matter what he did, Tomas was already 2 steps ahead. If he moved, Tomas would release everything. If he didn't, the silence would choke them all anyway. A brutal truth settled in his chest like ice. This wasn't a fight he could win by force. This was a war of exposure, of leverage, of control. Tomas wasn't the villain with a weapon. He was the villain who no longer needed one. Outside, lightning tore across the sky, and for a moment, the entire warehouse lit up in stark, merciless white. Hayley's figure was motionless, like a fragile sculpture about to crack under pressure. The rain outside blurred the world into gray, as if even the city wanted to turn away from what was unfolding here. Inside Tomas, there was a storm of his own. His vengeance wasn't born overnight. It had grown from years of being invisible, years of swallowing words, years of watching people like Bill and Hayley make choices that destroyed lives and called it business. He had waited for justice. But this wasn't justice anymore. This was personal. The difference was carved into the lines of his face. And beneath the fury, there was also a terrible calm. The calm of someone who had nothing left to lose. Randy's gaze flickered to Hayley again, but the woman in front of him wasn't the same one he had defended, trusted, believed in. She was part of the web. A piece in the machine Tomas had chosen to dismantle. And yet, buried beneath the anger, something in him still twisted in pain. Because even now, even after everything, a part of him wanted to believe she could be saved. But could she? Could any of them? No answers came. The silence pressed in harder, louder than any scream could ever be. No one moved. No one spoke. Only the soft static of the recording continued to spin the blade deeper. It was not just Hayley's fate hanging in the air. It was the entire legacy of the Dupree family. And somewhere beyond the rain, beyond the rust and the rot of that warehouse, more shadows were moving. Because a single recording was never the whole story. It was only the spark. What else had Tomas uncovered? Who else had been involved? And how deep did the rot really go? Randy could feel it now, like a rope tightening around all of them. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of something much darker. And the worst part wasn't Tomas's rage. It was the cold, calculated certainty in his eyes. The warehouse fell into a suffocating stillness, broken only by the distant echo of rain pounding against metal and concrete. The recording had ended, yet its weight lingered in the air like a toxin. Hayley's motionless form in the chair seemed almost unreal, a fragile figure caught between terror and resignation, while Randy's pulse throbbed in his ears, a chaotic rhythm of fear, anger, and helplessness. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to save her, to undo the consequences of choices made long before this night. Yet the cold calculation in Tomas's eyes warned that any impulsive move could ignite a chain reaction far worse than anything they had imagined. Tomas, standing over them, exuded a presence both controlled and volatile. His silence was a weapon, each pause in his movement magnifying the dread that wrapped around Randy like a vice. Years of humiliation, marginalization, and strategic patience had brought him to this exact moment. Every careful decision, every moment of feigned loyalty, had been a preparation for what he now commanded with quiet authority. The revelation of the recording was just the first fracture in the Dupree family's carefully constructed facade, yet it was enough to destabilize everything. Every glance, every subtle movement, carried the implication of consequences so profound that no one could yet see the end. Randy's mind raced. The fury he felt at Hayley, at Bill, and at the family that had allowed this treachery to fester, collided violently with the stark recognition of his own helplessness. Each secret exposed was a blade cutting deeper, but the questions were relentless. How long had Hayley been compromised? What had Bill truly concealed behind his polished exterior? How many layers of deception had Tomas peeled back to arrive here? The answers lay just out of reach, suspended in the tension that filled the room, each one a potential spark for irreversible chaos. Hayley, trapped yet defiant in her own way, was no longer merely a victim. Her silence, her vulnerability, paradoxically contained the power to shift the balance. Every subtle movement, every tear-streaked glance, hinted at unspoken knowledge, at unexpressed motives that could change the trajectory of the unfolding disaster. Randy could sense it, the threads of manipulation, the shifting allegiances, the invisible forces at play, but they were all intertwined in a web so intricate that one wrong move could collapse everything. Outside, the storm continued unabated, washing over the city in torrents of rain, mirroring the inner turmoil of those trapped within. Lightning flashed, illuminating the skeletal structure of the warehouse in stark, unforgiving detail. It was a reminder of fragility and exposure. Nothing in this night would remain hidden, not for long. Tomas's presence, a shadow of vengeance long cultivated, was a looming testament to the consequences of betrayal and ambition. He had orchestrated the revelation, yet even he could not predict how the remaining players would react when forced to confront the depth of lies, the extremity of manipulation, and the darkness simmering beneath the surface. As the minutes stretched into an eternity, the room became a crucible of internal conflict, moral ambiguity, and raw emotion. Randy, Hayley, and Tomas each stood at the precipice of irrevocable decisions, their minds spinning with the knowledge that no choice could be made lightly. The air was heavy with anticipation, and in that oppressive silence, the specter of inevitable confrontation loomed. Questions remained unanswered, alliances untested, and the ultimate outcome uncertain. The night offered no resolutions, only the harrowing certainty that once the storm passed, nothing could ever return to the way it was before. Every secret revealed, every act of betrayal exposed, had set in motion forces that would ripple outward, reshaping their world in ways yet unseen. In the darkness, only one truth was undeniable: the consequences of this night would haunt them all, long after the rain had ceased and the lights of the warehouse had faded into shadow.